Kids like you don't deserve my son. She whispered it, but the words didn't stay quiet. They traveled across the kitchen tiles, slipped past the half-closed pantry door, and landed straight into my daughter's ears. I didn't know she had heard it until later, until I saw the way her small hands were shaking while she tried to color inside the lines of her princess book. But in that moment, I stood frozen, holding a tray of teacups like a guest in my own house. My mother-in-law smiled sweetly at me after she said it. The kind of smile that looks polite but feels like a slap. "You're very lucky," she added, her voice dripping with something that wasn't kindness. "Lucky. Because I grew up without money. Because my father drove a rickshaw. Because I didn't come from their level." She had never said it this clearly before. Usually it came wrapped in advice, in comparisons, in little comments about standards and background. But this time, she said it plainly. And my daughter heard it. That night, while I was brushing her hair, she asked, "Mama, why don't I deserve Baba?" My heart cracked in places I didn't know existed. I asked her what she meant. She told me she had heard whisper something about kids like you. She asked me if we were the wrong kind of kids. I hugged her so tight she squeaked. "There is no wrong kind of kid," I told her. Ever. But I knew something had shifted. I could tolerate insults thrown at me. I had done it for years. For peace. For my husband. For the illusion of family harmony. But I would not let anyone make my daughter feel small in her own home. I didn't scream. I didn't confront her dramatically. I waited. Silence can be sharper than shouting if you know how to use it. Over the next few weeks, I became observant. I noticed how my husband still handled most financial decisions with his mother. How she casually mentioned investments she had advised him on. How she liked reminding guests that we helped them get started. That word again, helped. As if our life was charity. I knew something she didn't. 2 years ago, when my husband wanted to open his second branch of the business, the bank rejected his loan application. Quietly, without telling anyone, I used the savings I had built from freelancing late nights, money I never boasted about, to fill the gap. I told him it was a small contribution. He never asked how much. His mother assumed it came from her fixed deposits. I let her believe that. Until now, the opportunity came during a family dinner. Relatives filled the house. Laughter, plates clinking, conversations overlapping. My mother-in-law was in her element. She raised a toast to my husband's hard work, and then, smiling proudly, added, "Of course, guidance from elders matters. Experience matters." We made sure he never made foolish decisions. The room nodded. I watched my daughter sitting beside me, quiet. That's when I stood up. My voice didn't shake. I said, "Guidance matters. Support matters. Especially when banks refuse loans." The room went silent. My husband looked confused. I continued gently. "When the bank rejected the expansion loan, we were scared. But we found a way. I'm glad my late-night freelancing and savings could help us move forward." You could hear someone set their spoon down. My husband turned to me. "What?" I met his eyes. I transferred the remaining amount. "I didn't want you to feel pressured." He stared at me like he was seeing a new person. His mother's smile disappeared, just slightly. I wasn't finished. "And I'm proud of us," I added, "because no matter where we come from, what our parents did for work, or what level we're born into, we built this together." I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The message had landed. My husband asked me later that night why I had never told him the full amount. I told him the truth. Because I didn't want it to become a competition. I wanted it to be partnership. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that mattered more than any public speech. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not seeing." The next weekend, he moved all financial discussions into our shared office room. No more private calls with his mother about investments. No more subtle dependence. And something else changed. When his mother came over again, she was softer. Careful. She complimented my daughter's drawings. She asked me about my work. She never whispered anything like that again. But the real revenge wasn't in embarrassing her. It was in rewriting the narrative. My daughter now hears a different story. She hears her father proudly telling people, "My wife helped build this business." She hears me explain that dignity doesn't come from money, it comes from contribution. And the last time my mother-in-law tried to make a passing comment about background, my husband calmly said, "Amy, we don't measure people like that in this house. In this house, not hers, ours." That was the moment I knew I had won. Not by shouting, not by breaking relationships, but but by standing tall long enough for the truth to speak for me. And the little girl who once asked if she was the wrong kind of kid. Now she tells her friends, "My mama is a boss." And every time she says it, I remember that whisper. And I thought it was over. I thought one public truth was enough to silence a lifetime of quiet insults. I was wrong, because people who believe in levels don't surrender that easily. They just change tactics. A month after that dinner, my mother-in-law started a new habit. Small, harmless-looking comments. "You're very busy these days." Poor child, she stays with the maid a lot. Career women miss important moments. Never direct, never loud, but always within my daughter's hearing range. One evening, I came home early and found my daughter sitting alone, homework untouched. "Daddy says moms who work love money more than kids," she said softly. I didn't feel anger first. I felt exhaustion. How many times would I have to rebuild my child's confidence because someone else needed to feel superior? That night, I didn't cry. I planned. Revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation. My husband had been growing steadily in the business. Investors were starting to show interest. One of them suggested formalizing the company structure, adding directors, documenting ownership clearly. My husband told me over dinner, casually. That's when I saw it. The real power shift. For years, everything was informal. Decisions flowed through habit and tradition. His mother believed influence was her birthright. But paperwork doesn't care about birth order. Paperwork respects contribution. I asked my husband gently, "When you register the updated structure, will you include me officially?" He looked surprised. Of course. Why wouldn't I? I didn't answer that. Within 2 months, the company documents were updated. My name sat beside his as co-director. My initial capital contribution was recorded. My percentage was clear. Legal. Recognized. Permanent. I didn't announce it, I waited. The moment came during a family gathering for Eid. Relatives filled the house again. Tea was poured. Laughter floated. An uncle asked my husband about expansion plans. Before he could answer, my mother-in-law jumped in. "We're thinking of opening in Lahore next. It depends on our family decision." Our family decision. I stood up calmly and joined them. "Yes," I said warmly. "We've been reviewing Lahore projections. As co-director, I'm cautious about rental rates there. Karachi margins are still stronger." The word landed like a dropped glass. Co-director. The uncle blinked. "Sue director." My husband smiled proudly. "Yes, she's officially on board. Always has been in reality. Now it's legal too." I watched my mother-in-law's face. Not anger, shock. Because this wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't something she could dismiss as overreacting. It was documentation. Authority. Proof. She tried to recover. "Oh, that's nice. These formalities. It's important." My husband interrupted gently. "We both built this. We both." That night, something shifted permanently. The private whispers stopped. The subtle comments faded. Because now, undermining me meant undermining the company. Undermining the company meant undermining her son. And she would never do that. But the final moment, the one that truly satisfied me, came unexpectedly. A week later, my daughter had a school presentation titled, "My Hero." Parents were invited. I almost didn't go. I had a meeting scheduled. But then I remembered those words. Mums who work love money more than kids. I rescheduled the meeting. When my daughter walked onto the stage, she looked tiny under the bright lights. She held a paper in her shaking hands. "My hero is my mama," she began. My throat tightened. "She works very hard. She helps Baba in his office. Says only big people can run companies. My mama runs one. So she is very big." The room laughed softly. "She says nobody is wrong kind of kid. She says we build our own level." My mother-in-law was sitting 2 rows ahead. I watched her shoulders stiffen. "And when I grow up," my daughter continued, "I want to be like her. Not because she makes money. Because she makes decisions." The applause felt distant. I wasn't listening to the claps. I was listening to the silence behind me. The silence of a woman who once whispered that, "Kids like you don't deserve my son." Now that same kid was being raised by a woman whose name was on legal documents, whose voice shaped board meetings, whose daughter stood on stage with pride instead of doubt. After the presentation, my mother-in-law approached me. For the first time, there was no sugar in her tone. "She speaks very confidently," she said. "She hears everything." I replied gently. We held eye contact longer than we ever had. There was no apology, but there was understanding. She had tried to shrink me. Instead, I expanded. She had tried to define level. I redefined it. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's watching the person who doubted you adjust to a new reality where you cannot be dismissed. Sometimes it's your child never again asking if she is the wrong kind of kid. Now, when my mother-in-law visits, she brings gifts for my daughter and asks about school projects. She never whispers anymore, because she knows something now. The woman she once thought was lucky became indispensable. The kid she dismissed as growing up fearless. And the house that once echoed with quiet insults, it now echoes with my daughter's laughter and my husband saying, "Ask your mama." She decides? That is my revenge. Not destruction. Elevation. And trust me, it feels far. I thought the whispers were over. I thought respect had finally settled into the walls of our home. But prejudice doesn't disappear. It waits for opportunity. This time, it came wrapped in generosity. My mother-in-law announced she wanted to start an education fund for my daughter. For her future, she said sweetly in front of everyone, so she can marry well. Security is important for girls. Marry well, not study well, not build well. Marry well. My daughter was sitting right there, braiding her doll's hair. I smiled politely. That's thoughtful. But inside, I felt that old familiar burn. Later that evening, I overheard her on the phone with a relative. Of course I will guide the girl. Her mother is too career-minded. Girls need grounding. Grounding. As if ambition was a disease. I didn't confront her. Instead, I asked my daughter a question that night. What do you want to be when you grow up? She didn't hesitate. I want to own buildings. Big ones. And people will ask me for permission. I smiled in the dark. Permission. She had been listening more carefully than any of us realized. The next week, I scheduled a meeting with our financial advisor. Not my husband's. Mine. I opened a separate investment portfolio in my daughter's name, structured for education, entrepreneurship, long-term growth. Real assets, not symbolic savings. Then I did something else. I enrolled her in a weekend public speaking and leadership program. It wasn't cheap. It wasn't necessary at her age, but it was intentional. When my mother-in-law found out, she frowned. She's too young for all this pressure? It's not pressure? I replied calmly. It's preparation. She didn't argue. But I could see calculation in her eyes. The true turning point came during a larger family gathering at her sister's house. The conversation drifted toward children's futures, as it always does. One aunt asked my daughter, "Betta, will you become a doctor? Or a teacher?" Before she could answer, my mother-in-law laughed softly. "Let's see. First, she must learn balance. Too much ambition isn't good for girls." The room hummed in agreement. I didn't interrupt. I waited. My daughter looked at me across the room. I gave her a small nod. She turned back to the aunt. "I'm going to be an owner," she said clearly. "Owner of what?" "Of companies," she replied. "Like my mama?" Silence. Not awkward. Heavy. One cousin asked jokingly, "And who will run the house then?" My daughter shrugged. "Whoever is good at it." A few nervous laughs floated around. My mother-in-law's face tightened. "Children repeat what they hear," she said pointedly. "Yes," I agreed softly. "They do." The conversation moved on, but the message had landed. Later that evening, as we were leaving, my mother-in-law pulled me aside. "You're turning her against tradition," she said. I looked at her carefully. "No," I said. "I'm turning her toward confidence." She studied me like she was trying to decide whether I was still the same girl she once dismissed. I wasn't. And she knew it. Months passed. Our company secured a major partnership deal. It was the biggest step we had taken yet. The contract signing was formal, public, photographed. For the first time, both my husband and I were invited on stage to speak. My mother-in-law sat in the front row. When my turn came to speak, I didn't talk about revenue. I didn't talk about growth, I said. When we started, many people believed success belonged to certain backgrounds, certain families, certain levels. But we built this with belief, not pedigree. I paused. And I hope our children grow up knowing that worth is earned by effort, not inherited by status. Applause filled the hall. I didn't look at her. But I didn't need to. After the event, several relatives congratulated me directly. Not as someone's wife, not as someone lucky. As a leader. That night, something unexpected happened. My mother-in-law came to my room. She didn't sit. She stood quietly and said, "You have proven yourself." It wasn't warm. It wasn't affectionate. But it was real. I held her gaze. I never needed to prove myself. I just needed space to work. She nodded slowly. For the first time, there was no superiority in her posture. Just acknowledgement. And then she said something I never thought I would hear. "She is proud of you," she said, referring to my daughter. "I can see that," I smiled gently. That's all that matters. The final shift didn't happen in public. It happened weeks later when my daughter brought home a drawing. It showed our family standing in front of a tall building. Above it, she had written in uneven letters, "Our company? Not Baba's. Not family. Ours." When my mother-in-law saw the drawing, she didn't correct it. She didn't say lineage mattered. She simply said, "Wes." My daughter replied confidently, "We built it." We. That word used to exclude me. Now it included me. That is the revenge no one sees. Not humiliation. Not arguments. But transformation. The woman who once whispered that kids like me didn't deserve her son now introduces me as my daughter-in-law, the director. The little girl who once questioned her worth now walks into rooms like she belongs there. And me. I never screamed. I never insulted back. I built. I documented. I elevated. And I made sure my daughter heard a different whisper every single day. You deserve everything you work for. That is how I answered her. That is how I thought victory would feel loud. It didn't. It felt quiet, stable, like finally standing on solid ground after years of pretending not to notice the cracks. But there was one last test. It came disguised as concern. My mother-in-law fell ill that winter. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to require regular hospital visits and someone to manage her medications. Suddenly, the same career-minded woman she once criticized became very useful. My husband's work schedule was brutal. Expansion had doubled his responsibilities. Relatives who once had opinions were suddenly too busy. So I stepped in. Appointments, reports, insurance forms. I handled everything, not out of revenge, out of choice. And that's what made it powerful. One afternoon, while we were waiting in the hospital corridor, she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not physically. Emotionally. "You manage all this and the business?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "And the house?" "Yes." She stared at her hands for a long time. "I underestimated you," she said. There it was. Not dramatic, not poetic, honest. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't okay. Years of subtle humiliation don't vanish with one sentence. But I also didn't punish her. "We all grow," I said simply. She nodded slowly. Then she said something that closed a chapter I didn't even realize was still open. "I used to think background decides capacity. I was wrong. I let the silence stretch between us. That silence was different from the one years ago in my kitchen. This one wasn't sharp. It was reflective. When we returned home that evening, my daughter ran to hug her. "Did the doctor say you're strong?" she asked. My mother-in-law smiled faintly. "He said I must listen to your mama." My daughter beamed like she had just won a medal. And in that small exchange, I saw the full circle. The woman who once whispered that kids like mine didn't deserve her son was now telling doctors she needed to listen to me. Life has a way of balancing accounts without anyone raising their voice. The final moment, the one that truly sealed everything, came months later during a family wedding. Large hall, glittering lights. Distant relatives from cities I barely remembered visiting. I was used to the old pattern, polite smiles, subtle scanning, quiet judgment. But this time was different. When we entered, people greeted my husband first. Then they greeted me, not as an afterthought, but directly. "Congratulations on the new branch. We saw your interview online. You're an inspiration for working women." I saw my mother-in-law watching. Not with resentment, with something else. Recognition. Later, one elderly relative made a comment. "You're fortunate your son married someone ambitious. These days girls only care about comfort." Years ago, she would have agreed. Instead, she surprised everyone. She didn't marry for comfort. She said firmly, she built comfort. The table went quiet. I didn't react immediately. Because revenge isn't about watching someone change their words. It's about knowing you never begged them to. That night, as we were leaving, she held my daughter's hand tightly. "Study well," she told her. "Become bigger than all of us." There was no condition attached. No, but remember tradition. Just encouragement. On the drive home, my husband squeezed my hand. "You handled everything with so much patience," he said. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. Patience. People think patience is weakness. It isn't. It's strategy. If I had screamed that day in the kitchen, it would have become drama. If I had insulted her back, it would have become ego. Instead, I built something undeniable: authority, stability, legacy. And I made sure my daughter watched. Years from now, she won't remember the exact words her grandmother whispered. But she will remember what I did after hearing them. She will remember that her mother didn't shrink, she expanded. She didn't beg for validation. She created it. She didn't fight to belong. She made the room adjust. And the woman who once measured worth by background now measures it by resilience. That's the kind of revenge that doesn't destroy families. It reforms them. Now when my mother-in-law introduces me, she doesn't lower her voice. She says it clearly. This is my daughter-in-law. She is the reason our son stands taller. And every time she says it, I remember that kitchen. That whisper. That little girl asking if she was the wrong kind of kid. No, we were never the wrong kind. We were just waiting for the right moment to rise. And when we did, we didn't step over anyone. We simply stood so firmly that no one could ever look down on. I thought the story had reached its peak. But life always leaves you one final scene. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. My daughter came home from school, unusually quiet. She placed her bag down, walked straight to her grandmother, and asked, "What does class mean?" The room froze. My mother-in-law looked at me first, then back at her. "Why are you asking?" she said carefully. "A girl in my class said some people have class and some don't," my daughter replied. She said it depends on family. The old version of my mother-in-law would have smiled knowingly. The old version might have said, "She's not wrong." But this time, she didn't. She called my daughter closer and made her sit beside her. "Class," she said slowly, "is how you behave when you have power." I felt my breath catch. My daughter frowned. "No," she replied. "Power like education, position, respect." She paused, then added, "And real class is when you don't use those things to make someone feel small." The silence that followed was heavy, but not painful. Transformative. My daughter nodded thoughtfully and ran off to finish her homework. I stayed where I was. Because that sentence wasn't for the child. It was for me. Later that night, when we were alone in the kitchen, the same kitchen where years ago she had whispered that cruel sentence, she spoke without turning around. "I used to think protecting my son meant controlling who stood beside him," she said. "I didn't realize strength doesn't need protection. It needs partnership." I didn't rush to respond. She continued, "You proved that without ever humiliating me." That was the final piece. Revenge would have been easy if I had torn her down. But true victory, it was watching her rebuild herself. "I never wanted to fight you," I said quietly. "I just wanted my daughter to never doubt her worth." She nodded. "She won't," she replied. And for the first time, I believed it completely. Now when my daughter walks through this house, she walks with ownership. Not inherited. Modeled. She doesn't ask if she deserves her father. She doesn't wonder about levels. She talks about investments at the dinner table. She asks questions in meetings when she visits the office. She sees both her parents sign documents. And sometimes, I catch my mother-in-law watching her with something close to pride. Not possessive pride, shared pride. The whisper that once tried to shrink us became the foundation of something stronger. Because I didn't answer it with noise. I answered it with growth. And growth is the kind